Hello and welcome to the Vanquished. Anders J. Lee here,
Freddie G here. So happy to be here.
and we are talking about a special character in our canon, someone who I said from the beginning I was going to save for the very last, and that is Bernard Sanders, talking about a pertinent section of it to today, and that is his mayoralty, his time as Burlington mayor, with a special guest. And this is an important topic, of course, because we're facing down a socialist, perhaps being in charge of a city that's even bigger than Burlington, Vermont. Come to think of it, and also it's relevant for us. I feel like this is a very personally inspiring moment. We're talking before the show about what this section in Bernie Sanders' life means to us podcasters.
So Bernie was aimless in his 30s. He's divorced. He's got a kid. He's making documentaries on Eugene v. Debs that are getting rejected by like PBS networks. And he's run for, I believe, governor 3 times. I'm not sure if also senator, but he's
Senator,
run a bunch
definitely
of
senator. I think maybe governor once or twice.
yeah, he's been running and losing, and he's a third party guy. I mean, he's very much like, is he going to be just like Vermont's Jill Stein, and just some divorced dude and aimless? And no, he then runs for mayor of Burlington and wins. So inspiring to us young guys in our early 40s. It is really nice. And yeah, he is the only socialist mayor who's also a presidential loser. So we were very excited to do this episode.
Yeah, this is what Hillary Clinton would go on to call his first job, which I felt very defensive at the time. You are insulting the carpenters of America. He worked as a carpenter, the documentarians of America. He did that. But Bernie himself would say, yeah, this was kind of my first job. He's because remember seeing one interview with him where they're like, "You were a carpenter," and he's like, "Well, I hammered a few nails. I don't know if I'd say I was a carpenter." Um, so this really was the beginning moment of his political career, and it's such a unique story because most of the people we cover on this show are trying to be the president from birth, essentially, and he's kind of like trying to do everything to avoid being president. It seems like, and history has thrust him forward to be the mayor, be a congressman and senator, and then not be president. It is a unique sort of trajectory for a politician, and we had a really interesting chat about this period in Bernie's life with someone who's covered it quite a bit for Jacobin, and that is Branko Marcetic. Let's go to our interview with him.
They are the vanquished.
We're now joined by Branko Marcetic. Branko, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for pronouncing my name really well.
Yeah, I usually ask people right before we start recording, and I forgot, but then I just, somewhere back in the wells of my brain, remembered you being interviewed somewhere else. And I'm good at very few things in life, but remembering pronunciations is one of them.
It's a good lesson, just have faith, have courage, believe in yourself, and you'll get it right most of the time.
What's like the worst someone has ever butchered it, would you say?
Ooh, I mean, I'm trying to remember the specific one. I remember ones where people have completely gotten the order of the consonants and everything right. Like it's like, I think sometimes I can understand this. You see a weird name and your brain has not figured out how to like automatically convert that into a sound, so you just kind of make up what you think is.
Yeah.
You see the first letter and then you're like, I'll just do a string of noises, and that'll do it.
That's, I mean, usually a lot of people get it for my name, but then a lot of people call me Andres. The people who've known me for years will still do the R-E first. I guess I could conceivably be Spanish. But I am not. I am of Nordic extraction, which makes me Bernie a fan of my people, I guess. Ironically, given that he's very not that. But yeah, we're talking today about his mayoralty, as mayor of Burlington, which is a topic we wanted to talk about. We've been kind of saving Bernie for a while because we talk about failed presidential candidates on this show, kind of saving him for later. But this element of his career is really interesting because it is hopefully going to be relevant here in New York City, albeit on a different scale in a few months when Zohran is sworn in, God willing. But you're the author of really the definitive piece, I would say, on Bernie's mayoralty, really the beginning of it. But you wrote this back in, I guess you started writing it during the 2020 primaries, but it's a lot of it is together in an article in Jacobin, how Bernie Sanders, an open socialist, won Burlington's mayoral election. What made you start researching this period and write this, I guess, series of pieces?
I mean, obviously, Sanders started running for president. I was a big fan of his. I still think he's a singular political figure, and I had kind of through my journalism career, I suppose, made a name for myself writing these long kind of looks into various political figures' histories. And usually they were all bad. It was Kamala Harris or Pete Buttigieg or whatever. And you would just get depressed reading this, finding out how terrible this person was. And I thought it would be interesting to do that with someone who actually seemed to have good politics and had a good political record. So I did a little bit of research on Sanders initially. There were a few books written about his mayoralty. And what I found out very early on was that beyond just reading nice things about a politician who was actually decent and honest and not completely corrupt, it was also just a really great story. I mean, those first 2 years in particular when he was mayor, the things he had to overcome, the kind of entrenched opposition from every sector of the city of Burlington, and the way that he struggled and ultimately did overcome it, I think it's an important story, both in terms of what a politician can do, but I think also in terms of what a political movement is able to do when working in concert with a politician who is on board with what they want to do.
Yeah, a lot of this, Fred and I were talking, it kind of sounds like it could be a movie of some kind, like the the life of Bernie, but particularly him as mayor of Burlington. There's a lot of sort of fun, quirky, maybe like dark Parks and Rec, if you will, or more a better Parks and Rec with better politics.
Oh yeah, this
Um,
would be an amazing movie. There's a movie about young Obama called Barry that was very forgettable. This would be young Bernie. There's an election. There's every character actor gets to play some guy from Vermont. They have every ethnic group, or at least of white people represented. And then even that he meets his future wife on the campaign, and even has a love interest, which you would not expect in a Bernie Sanders movie.
No, definitely not. I mean, I might be breaking news here a little bit, but there actually had been at one point. I mean, we're nowhere, but there was an effort to make it into a movie, and I ended up kind of writing a treatment for a story. I mean, it was going to be a comedy, so it was going to be kind of silly, and there was a lot of stuff that
Wow.
was not remotely historically accurate. But it would have been kind of fun. But like most. Hollywood projects that ultimately went nowhere and died. So but who knows? Who knows? Maybe
was
in the future.
was James Adomian going to play Bernie?
It's a good question. I don't know who would have played. I feel like there was talk of having it so like Larry David or something would be involved. Maybe
Oh man.
Adomian. Now that you say that, I don't know if you saying that has just made me invent a memory in my head or if there actually
Okay.
was. If I remember genuinely hearing that. But yeah, there was some interesting stuff to do with it. It's a shame it never went off the ground.
Yeah. Also, I mean, Larry David would be really funny because obviously he's much older than Bernie was at the time. Then again, he's looked the same, as is often remarked, for the past like 40 years. I mean, maybe a few darker hairs on his head when he's first elected. But
And their cousins apparently, long
right,
lost cousins or something.
right. But he winds up in Vermont after going to the University of Chicago and is moving there at a time when a lot of young sort of hippies are late 60s, 70s. What did you find out about kind of the Vermont political scene at that time? Because it in a way seems very reminiscent of, ironically, the place where Bernie comes from today, Brooklyn, where it's that's for better or worse, that's kind of Zohran's base is young left wing people, and uh, increasingly middle aged as well as we get older, millennials. But what was Vermont like in the 70s?
Yeah, no political figure comes out of a vacuum. So Sanders was a product of this wider social, cultural, political change in Vermont. Vermont was for a long time, for its entire history, really, this very, very rural conservative state. I think it voted for a Republican president once in like 200 years or something, or 100 years. But in the 60s and beyond, you start to see these waves of immigration coming in that changed the way that the state was, and particularly in Burlington. And so through the 60s and onwards, you get the kind of counterculture, hippie, generally kind of like young left wing people moving into the state. Some of them are back to the landers, but they held a variety of political beliefs. They're not, necessarily all kind of doctrinaire lefties. And Sanders was one of these people. At the time, he and his wife, the idea was that they would buy a plot of land and live a rural existence, but a kind of socialistic rural existence that mirrored the experience that Sanders had had. I think he spent a summer at a kibbutz in Israel, and he to him this was the kind of like ideal form of living, this communal living where everyone kind of pitched in and did things. It was socialism on, I guess, a smaller scale. And so that was the idea originally. The things got complicated. Sanders got divorced, and that was a whole thing. But that was ultimately the origin of his move to Vermont, and eventually he went to Burlington and became kind of a activist and a perennial also ran candidate for a local left wing party there.
Right, and that's the Liberty Union Party, which very patriotic sounding name, but obviously more of a radical bent. What was, I guess, did they have like a specific sect or place within the socialist or Marxist canon, or they're just kind of a grab bag of different weirdos?
I would say the grab bag of different weirdos. I mean, one person I spoke to, one of Sanders' allies, talked about how this is one of the frustrations that Sanders had with the party, and I think with activists generally. I know how much people know, but every now and then, you'll hear or read stories about Sanders' kind of quiet disdain for activists, even though he understands that these are important roles. He's frustrated by some of the ultra leftism that he would see, and then with Liberty Union, one of his allies told me Sanders would be frustrated by the fact that the founder of the party would go on a radio show and he would end up getting into arguments over why children should be able to vote. Which whatever you feel about that particular position, it's not exactly a majoritarian position.
Yeah.
I don't think it's just a losing.
But if you have a majority of children, then that could be, you could have a popular program there if you just
Right.
find a way to get all the kids eligible.
What age are we talking about?
Right. Yeah. But this is I think this kind of gets to a big and enduring divide between Sanders and some of the activist movement around him, and also to some extent some of his base, and that would go on even until the present day. Sanders is a radical, but by virtue of the position that he occupies, he's not he is a guy who runs on the most kind of leftward-most fringe that you can run on within the kind of mainstream of, let's say, modern Western society, or at least modern American society. He's a guy who is very expert, some would say ruthless or cautious around picking his battles. And we see that often in foreign policy, less so over the years, although even now a little bit. He tends to, his focus is on the domestic stuff. He wants to expand people's horizons there, but he's not going to go past what he thinks is going to be kind of beyond the pale to people. I think his position on healthcare. I think he thinks Medicare for all, that is as radical as you can go in the modern American context, and that's as far as you can push it. Tellingly, back in the 70s when he was in the Liberty Union Party and he ran for president, I think four times. He ran a platform of like nationalizing everything.
Wait, did he run for president too, or just?
Sorry. He ran. Yeah, sorry, not president. He ran for senate. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
And I mean, yeah, his platform was nationalizing everything. That was not his platform in 2020 or 2016. Even though I'm sure in his heart of hearts that would be what he would want to do, but he knew that would kind of the voting public in America was not ready for that.
Right. Yeah, he's very deft at finding the exact niche of how radical you can go in American politics, which can be very hard to figure out. And it's something that again Zohran was very effective at as well. Is no, there's a lane slightly to the left of where the leftmost Democrat is now. I'm going to take that, and it ended up working. But he ends up leaving the Liberty Union Party. That's, I guess, over internecine stuff. With you mentioned the guy who wants kids to vote. But does he flirt with any other parties? Because I know the Citizens Party is around in the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah, not really. I mean, when he decides to run, he ends up kind of. There's a loose alliance with the Citizens Party. Like a number of his allies end up running on its slate, and then actually win election to alderman. But Sanders himself has a little more of a distance from it, and that's partly. I mean, I was never really able to figure to find out exactly why. No one ever totally told me, but I think one clue is in the fact that the Citizens Party had this kind of anti-police sentiment that is not unusual for activist circles. Sanders, notably, a big part of his win in the first mayoral race was the fact that he got the local police union on board. Basically because they were very angry with the current mayor because he had done all these budget cuts and just generally pay and everything was not very good for the local police. And Sanders promised that he would try and make things better for them. So that was a really key moment for him in winning. And I suspect, again, this is just me, kind of extrapolating from this, but I suspect that Sanders thought that maybe some of their positions in certain topics, including that one, might end up being an anchor on him. And might hold him back.
Yeah, because he does decide to run in 1981. Seems sort of reluctant because for a while he's done with politics, he's done with being a candidate, and instead he's selling film strips to schools throughout New England. And yeah, as Fred and I were talking, he's in a way kind of an inspiration to 30 somethings who don't quite have our shit together. But he is a reluctant hero. He doesn't really want to get dragged back into this. Does it seem like in his heart of hearts he really wants power, or is he just kind of the last guy in the room was yeah, okay, I'll do it?
That's a good question. I mean, I know that when he first ran for the Liberty Union position, they had a bunch of people in the room, and they were kind of like, "Who wants to run?" And he was the one who kind of put his hand up. But I don't think he ever really believed he was going to win in that position. I think the idea was more we're going to run these kind of educational campaigns. We'll run these activist campaigns that end up, I don't know, broadening people's horizons, bringing up issues that might not otherwise get brought up. So the typical kind of stuff a protest candidate does. I think with the mayoral run in '81, that is when he and his allies are really serious about winning. I mean, part of the reason that he left Liberty Union, he was like, this is part of it. There's other stuff. There was internal stuff too, but I think he was like, I'm done just running campaigns just to run campaigns. This is a waste of time. But they were really serious about winning because they looked at the fact that he had increased his share of the vote every single year he ran. He was obviously a really effective campaigner and a really effective communicator. And I think they also looked at the fact that in Burlington specifically, that was where he did the best, and he did really well in the working class wards. And Liberty Union in general had had a candidate who had done pretty well in that area too. So they figured, that combined with the fact that there was all this dissatisfaction in the city over the cost of living, over the sort of stranglehold on politics by the city establishment, that this was all fertile ground to maybe run this insurgent campaign that could actually do something.
Yeah. And there are other people maybe who are going to run as well. This guy, Greg Guma, who wrote a book about Sanders' mayoralty, who decides not to run in part because he's shorter than Bernie and figures that unfortunately plays a role in politics. But what are his odds when he launches this campaign against the incumbent Democrat?
Oh, very low. I mean, I don't think anyone. I think they were trying to win, but I don't think anyone really expected that the campaign would take off like it did. No one, I think, around Sanders, but definitely no one in the press either. No one really paid much attention. It took a while for him to really break through. Actually, the mayor didn't even really, didn't want to debate him, mispronounced his name, mostly ignored him. Another kind of parallel to Mamdani's one in New York.
Yeah.
Really, I think blindsided people. But I think it as the campaign went on, it kind of progressively revealed how much dissatisfaction there was in the city and how hungry people were for some kind of alternative to what was there.
And that incumbent Gordon Paquette had been in office for a while. He was challenged, but didn't take his opposition seriously before Sanders. What was the state of affairs in Burlington leading up to the early '80s?
I mean, it was kind of a decline of living standards, where you had property tax being raised constantly, while at the same time you had budget cuts that Paquette kept putting into place. So people felt like they were getting taxed to the hilt, and getting very little for it. And in that sense, it was kind of an interesting overlap with the general direction of the country, because at the time, obviously, late '70s, in the '80s, you have the Reagan Revolution, and the Reagan Revolution was kind of preceded by the kind of Californian and then nationwide tax revolt. So people were, obviously that fed into a wider right wing shift. But I think what was interesting about the Sanders campaign is it took what was everywhere else a right wing issue, and he kind of pivoted it to feed into a left wing campaign. It's actually interesting to compare that to, when I wrote this book about Joe Biden years ago. Biden kind of came up in a very similar era. He obviously became a senator 10 years earlier than Sanders won mayor, but Biden ran for re-election for the first time in the middle of that anti-tax revolt. And unlike Sanders, his Sanders' campaign was, the property tax is terrible. It sucks. People are getting gouged. We need to do something about that. and we need to, we need to tax the wealthy so that we can pay for city services, yada yada yada. Biden just really full on swallowed the kind of Reaganite logic of the anti-tax revolt, where he got spooked by it, and he said, yeah, no, we totally need to cut the budget, and we need to cut all this stuff. We don't have any money. We need to lower taxes. So it's two very different approaches to that topic. Both ended up being successful. If you define success as kind of just winning re-election and nothing else.
Right. And on the merits, like that conceivably could be a contradiction with socialist politics to be for lowering or eliminating property taxes. But why is that an important thing for us to take up and not just assume necessarily that, if you own property, you're a capitalist, a homeowner, etc.?
Well, yeah, I mean, taxes can be regressive and progressive. I mean, there's a lot of regressive tax out there. Sales taxes are regressive, and they tend to be often what a lot of politicians will lean on to raise revenue. And look, sometimes, I mean, you have to do things that are regressive or unpopular because maybe you don't have any other option. But I think now, and certainly probably in I would say Burlington in the 80s, that was not necessarily the only option that was available to them to just raise property taxes. It was the path of least resistance, in the same sense that, it's a lot easier for a lot of politicians to go, well, I'm going to pick a fight with, or not even pick a fight, I'm just going to make poor and middle income people pay more so that I can keep the lights on. But I don't want to pick a fight with the really rich people because they'll get really angry. So it's just easier for me to screw over these guys. And I think that was what was kind of going on in Burlington. And Sanders' attempt, I mean, he kind of used property taxes as this perennial foil for the rest of his mayoral career, where he would just constantly rail against it. But he did try to make some attempts to shift the tax burden away from property owners who, weren't necessarily rich people. I mean, this was a time when you could buy a house, even if you were median or lower income. And then what you were left with, you're going to pay more and more of your income, your meager income, to pay off those taxes. And so later on in his first term, he actually tried to and succeeded in kind of levying this tax on hotels. So the idea was, okay, we're going to basically do a business tax, a very, very small tax on hotels and bars, so that we don't have to keep raising the property tax and basically to deal with this fiscal crisis that he ended up having to deal with.
Yeah. Well, there's that. You mentioned him living on a kibbutz, which a lot of his supporters now would look back in retrospect with some skepticism. And then also, as you mentioned, he had the support of the police unions. So his career is really the result of a few of these contradictions. But there is, I guess, learned sort of reading the article that there was a bit of a contradiction, but again, between the rank and file police and the police chief, who endorsed Paquette, even campaigned for him in uniform. But the rank and file there, how was Bernie able to get their support through their union?
Well, he ran an anti-austerity campaign. He said he treated them as workers, and he said, I know that basically you've been shafted by the current mayor for a number of years, and if I win, I'm going to be a lot more friendlier to worker demands, which he did end up being. I mean, when one of his early successes when he was mayor was that he was able to renegotiate contracts with city workers like police and others in a fairly quick and not rancorous manner. So it didn't end up disrupting city services. It didn't end up, becoming these protracted battles, because by taking a more kind of reflexively pro-union, pro-worker stance, it just made negotiation a lot simpler, even though sometimes it did mean in these contract negotiations, workers, because of the fiscal state of Burlington, workers had to accept kind of a shitty deal, but they could tell that they were not being screwed over by Sanders. So I think that was and I would say that not just Sanders' story. I think that there's been a number of instances in recent years where I think we can see that whatever you feel about the police and the role of police, winning a municipal campaign, any kind of municipal campaign, while inviting, and galvanizing hostility from local police is just political disaster. And a good example of that is unfortunately the India Walton campaign in Buffalo, where she won the Democratic primary but ended up losing, and that was in large part because of massive turnout in the parts of the city where all the police and firefighters lived. And it's not fair, but that is I think a political reality.
Yeah, and that is a suggestion Bernie has made to Zohran, is to try and get the police union's endorsement, which in New York City, I don't think that's going to happen. He did get, I think, one association of South Asian police members, but that, definitely a formative experience for him in doing that. And also in Burlington, you're right, the establishment was kind of divided. There was sort of this understanding between the different immigrant groups, French Catholics and Irish as well as Italians. But they were all sort of a little fed up with Paquette in a way that maybe he hadn't fully appreciated. How was Bernie able to kind of exploit the fissures within Burlington's political class?
Yeah, well, there was a lot of ethnic resentment, and it was all like, I mean, Burlington was, I think, completely white, almost completely white.
No.
So it was all like white ethnic inter resentment,
Right.
and the kind of former French immigrants tended to be kind of the represented in the political class. Then you had the Italians, who felt like they had been screwed over by these urban renewal projects that had just kind of led to the dismantling of housing and neighborhoods and displacement of people. So they felt a tremendous amount of resentment towards the kind of ruling establishment of Burlington at the time. There was also a fissure between the kind of the parties. The Democrats had dominated Burlington politics for a long time, but it wasn't really, even though Vermont was a Republican state at the time, but they weren't like liberal Democrat. They weren't even kind of liberals, as we were thinking in the post New Deal era. They were just kind of that. The Democratic Party dominated, and so if you were a conservative, you would still run as a Democrat because that was the only game in town. And there were some Republican aldermen, but they had, I mean, I'm not sure if they had ever, controlled city council or if they had when it was, but basically there was just this kind of deal where, I don't know, you had 2 or 3 Republicans on the city council, and then it was mostly Democrats running the show, and they maybe threw them a few bones here and there, but the Republicans basically had no leverage. And one of the kind of key moments for Sanders in this early period, when he was facing this insane level of obstruction from Paquette's allies once he beat him, was that he kind of went around the Democrats. He made a deal with some Republicans and said, if you support me on this, I'll throw you a bone here and there. And that was one of the breakthrough moments in his presidency. So yeah, they were able to kind of, like you said, exploit these gaps that had emerged in Burlington's political culture.
And is there a moment in researching this campaign where the establishment and the press in Burlington starts to say before election night, oh, wow, he could actually win?
Yeah, I think one of the moments came in a debate with Paquette, who had for ages refused to debate Sanders or even acknowledge they existed. But some local activists who backed Sanders had organized this debate, and they very cleverly packed the room with their own people. And that debate, I believe, went out on the radio. And so, you had Paquette, who had been in power at this point, I think 10 years, 9 or 10 years. And, had gotten complacent, had kind of for a long time been at the mercy of the local business establishment and just kind of did whatever they wanted to do. And just, had not really had to campaign for a long time. And he got out there and he sounded really out of touch. There were a few lines that he said in the debate where the crowd, was hissing at him and booing him. And then meanwhile, Sanders would say a lot of stuff that I think would sound familiar to us now, knowing him, for the past 10 years, and you would hear the crowd cheer, and people heard that. And I think that was the moment where, obviously, yes, they had stacked the audience, but I think people start to think, oh, okay, this guy isn't just this wild crackpot. He actually is a serious guy, and he has ideas that I, as a citizen of Burlington, actually kind of agree with.
Hmm. And he ends up winning on election night by 12 votes. Later, that goes to a recount. Did they try to steal it from him? Were there any hijinks?
Yeah, there was a whole incident where I believe the votes were locked up in a safe, and then I think the recount was oh no, there was a recount. Then there was a court challenge, and then Sanders' allies were really worried that there was going to be some kind of shady stuff. I believe it's not actually clear whether there was going to be, but they were just kind of freaked out that maybe this could be stolen from them, because there had been some shady stuff that happened during the campaign. You mentioned the police chief campaigning in uniform for the incumbent. So there's this moment where, in the middle of the night, they drive over to a judge's house and wake him up, and they're like, "We need you to sign an injunction to stop them from taking these votes."
Wow.
But yeah, but yeah. I mean, I think if I'm remembering correctly, in the recount, he ended up winning by a slightly larger margin, but it wasn't a whole lot.
Yeah,
So,
I think it's about 10 more votes that they pick up.
yeah.
Yeah, if Bernie had lost that, what do you think happens then? Does he leave politics? Like, does he never have this career, or does he end up just running again 2 years later for Burlington mayor? Like, how important were these 12 or 13 or however many votes?
Oh, I feel like he would have run again. I mean, to go from a guy who was, a sort of a joke candidate, an activist candidate who, got the best thing he ever did in Vermont statewide was 6%, to nearly winning the mayoralty out of nowhere. I can't imagine him not winning, not running again. I feel like they would have gone, even if they had, stolen it, or even if they'd done a recount, they found, oh, actually, no, Sanders loses by 5. That would have been a signal. Hey, hold on, people are really dissatisfied. I have a chance here if I run again, and run a more intense campaign. If I'd stay in the public eye for another 2 years, who knows? By next time, I could have this guy. So I'm sure. Ultimately, it was better that he won that year, because that would have he still would have had to face all this insane opposition that he faced. But yeah, I think he would have run again.
Hmm. And he does appear on Donahue, or on I think the Today Show, and Donahue is hosting. So before Phil Donahue has his talk show, but not he definitely, that's the type of person he would have on later on in the 90s. But he goes on the Today Show and is asked back, and this is before he's sworn in. But interestingly, he did not want to keep doing the national TV circuit. What was the reason for that calculation? Did he think that he would like lose credibility with the people of Burlington if now he's like the face of socialism?
Yeah, I suspect that's it. Yeah, I think he wanted to focus on Burlington's problems, and not become a kind of celebrity or a media figure. And I think also, I feel like the focus on local politics allowed him to sidestep some of the, I mean, if he became this kind of subject of a national circus, and during the Reagan era, He's a socialist. It would distract from. He really built a brand as a politician who was not. He was a socialist, sure, but he was not a guy who was just running this kind of ideological crusade. He built a brand as a guy who was an effective administrator of a city and dealt with local issues. And to be clear, I mean that was not his initial interests. They really, their plan was, we want to use the city of Burlington as a stepping stone to build power throughout the state and hopefully around the country. But they knew that part of that had to be, they had to really smarten up about what were the local issues and be seen as an effective administration on that level. So I think for that reason, he shunned it. But to be sure, he was still the subject of national attention from time to time. And certainly for left wing magazines and sometimes even right wing ones, he was an object of fascination because in the 1980s to have an open socialist running any city is a curiosity.
Right. And probably some left-wing newspapers denouncing him as a social democrat and whatnot. But it is, I mean, he it does obviously become a congressman and later a senator and presidential candidate. But one of the criticisms of him from the left, aside from being a quote-unquote reformist, is that he hasn't really developed any sort of apprentices, people to fill in for him and run for other seats, because and that goes to not being part of a party or an organization. Do you think that's a fair criticism, or is he just kind of like, this is the best we can do?
No, I think it's a fair criticism. I mean, I think alongside that, people have in Vermont have complained about the fact that he never built a third party, or never really. He kept his distance from any sort of third party efforts. There is a progressive party in Vermont, and it kind of did well over the years, both using and because of Sanders, but also kind of in spite of him, because he in the same way that he kept his distance from the Citizens Party when he first ran, he would continually keep his distance and remain an independent. And I think that is because he realized very early on that this label of independent is it's a huge political benefit in the United States, because as a guy who, I mean, he's a socialist. And by the way, he did not announce I'm a socialist. That kind of, his socialist affiliation only really became news further into the campaign. I think actually the election had already been done by the time that this. Huh. Yeah. So, I think initially he was not going to run as a socialist. He definitely did not run as a socialist. But it was just kind of forced on him. But I think he realized that, if I'm going to run this kind of anti-establishment campaign, and if I'm going to make my way through American politics running against the establishment, it's helpful to be known as an independent, for that to be the main label that's affixed to me rather than anything else, because I can always say to hell with all of them. I oppose them all. I'm going to fight them all. So I think that's kind of what was driving it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. He doesn't, though, as you said, doesn't ditch the label. So like, he doesn't say, "Oh, I once was, but I am now no longer a socialist." And it's funny, people as late as 2019 were saying like, "Well, it's time for him to stop calling himself a socialist," which like would have been a bit ridiculous for him to say as like an almost 80-year-old. Like, "Yep, I've seen the light." Read Adam Smith, no longer buy into that stuff, but he is open about it, even when the FBI is spying, or not spying on him, but investigating his election and his affiliation with the Socialist Workers Party, for which he served as an elector. What's the story with that? Because that's it's kind of a scandal that pops up early on.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's kind of a small blip in the story. I mean, it's not like the FBI was ever, at least that we know of, was involved in trying to destroy him. But I think it symbolized, because the FBI came to visit him, and
Right.
and everything, and it was just kind of an alarming thing. because, you know, at that point you were only what a couple, no, not even a couple of decades, maybe like 10 years divorced from COINTELPRO, you know,
Mm.
and harassment of the left by the FBI and other agencies. So I think it symbolized, number one, the degree of hostility and suspicion in American politics at the time towards anything that smacked of leftism, organized leftism. And then I think it also, for a lot of his supporters, kind of, it crystallized for them like, oh my God, you know, he's really, you know, okay, sure, he's only the mayor of this tiny town in Vermont, a state that no one ever thinks twice about, but wow, they really want to, you know, destroy him potentially. So in some ways, it may have helped him because it may have, you know, kind of galvanized his support a little more, you know, which was, I think, crucial to his mayoralty ultimately.
Yeah. And he also faces a lot of opposition, obviously, from the city's political establishment, including the city council. Seems like Gordon Paquette is kind of giving them advice and pointers behind the scenes. What are some of the examples of the early intransigence he faces as mayor?
Oh yeah, I mean that stuff is pretty famous in Burlington still, I think, and Sanders would say, you know, that years later when he had already, you know, won re-election many times, he would say, you know, I would never forget how they treated me when I came in. I mean, their plan was not unlike what the Republicans did with Obama when he won. Their plan was, this guy is illegitimate. He won by a fluke. We are going to block everything he wants to do. And, you know, and Burlington was a weak mayor system. So the city council really called the shots in many ways. But they decided to use that to just stop him from getting anything done. They famously fired his secretary. He hired his campaign manager as his secretary, and then they said, no, we're not going to let you do that. Incredibly petty. Surely one of the pettiest things anyone in politics has done. They blocked all of his appointments. I mean, the way that the Burlington mayor got anything done really, or exerted power in the city's mayoral system, was to make appointments to these different kind of departments, and then his or her people would then go on to enact his agenda. But they said, no, we're not going to approve anyone that you nominate. I think in the end, they while he was away, I can't remember where he was, but he was out of office, and then while he was gone, the city council basically approved the resignation of his civil defense director, I think, and put someone else. And then that was a subject of a whole battle as well. They there was a fiscal crisis, as I mentioned before, that he inherited, and he wanted to try and plug the budget gaps without raising the property tax, because that was a key promise. By the way, it's that was one of the big mistakes Brian Johnson in Chicago made, was he also not raising the property tax, and then he ended up proposing raising the property tax. Very, very bad idea.
Yeah.
I would not advise anyone in a position of mayor to do that. But yeah, so he was trying to do that, and then he proposed this very small tax increase, and he proposed basically raising fines, like city fines for parking and all kinds of other stuff. Really just cobbling together what he could while making as little cuts as possible to government departments. And then they actually kind of ended up trying to halve his tax increase. Wow. And which again, another petty thing. But I think in this case, ultimately the Democratic establishment in Burlington was not willing to plunge the city into a fiscal crisis, so they ended up going with it. And I think also that was the element where he had kind of gone around some of the Democrats and gotten some of the Republicans on board, because they were for fiscal responsibility, so he was able to kind of, work with them and get the sign on for what he wanted to do.
Interesting. Yeah, and he also sets up kind of almost a parallel government, I think you wrote, with his supporters, volunteers. There's people who he kind of self-appoints to different roles in an unofficial capacity. He just pays them out of his own salary. How does he kind of build a movement from the mayor's office?
Yeah, it's a really interesting story of how potentially you can get things done, or you can at least try and do something, even if you lack the political power to do it. So he kind of set up, because they didn't let him appoint the people he wanted to appoint to these different departments. He ended up kind of just relying on volunteer labor, because he had this groundswell of popular support, because he had this activist energy behind him that had gotten him elected. Those people, wanted to see him succeed, and so he would put out the word, let's start a volunteer organization for housing, or for the arts, or for whatever issue that he wanted that was important to the city. And then they didn't have any formal power, but that was kind of a way to give activist groups more of a place at the table, give them more prominence. And he would use his mayoral power, or his status as mayor, rather. He would go to tenant disputes, for instance, and say, you guys should do a rent strike. I support you in your um, dispute with your landlord. Or he would, if there was a worker strike or some kind of worker disgruntlement, he would say, meet with them, and he would go, if you guys should form a union, and if you form a union, I will do what I can to support you. And so that was some of the ways that he, in his early in this early period where he just couldn't do anything, kind of, I think, one, helped to empower, to the extent he could, activist movements around him, but I think also signaled to the city, okay, I'm not being allowed to do what I campaigned on. They are stopping me, but I am still out here hustling and sweating and doing everything I can to fight for you, which ultimately benefited him when the elections would come up a year later. And another thing that he did was he had this whole volunteer kind of circus that he helped organize, where he got all the local artists and everything to put on this kind of people circus, I believe is what it was called. And the idea was that he wanted to show, okay, hey, here's a way that the government can play a positive role in people's lives. It's not going to be political. It'll only be political in the sense of, it's going to be this fun, enjoyable, nice thing that the city can have a good time with, and it's just it shows that government can be just a positive thing in people's lives.
And there's another pretty funny moment where he kind of flexes his muscles, I guess, and maybe appeals to some law and order sensibilities by shutting down the spring fling,
Right.
which was a big. How would you describe it? Just a weird sort of big party that young people would have every year in Burlington. But Bernie, in his it's really his inner old guy comes out in this moment. How does he put a stop to this ruckus?
Yeah, that was a big thing. I mean, he wanted to show that he could just be a competent administrator, that he wasn't going to do any crazy things. And people in Burlington, there was a kind of a divide between the college students who, tend to be more raucous and a little more wild, and then the people who are permanent residents there, who want to live a quiet life and don't want garbage all over the streets and kids getting drunk and doing God knows what around their neighborhoods. And so he had to toe a balance there. And he I think in advance where he said, look, I'm not going to tolerate any kind of violence or vandalism or whatever. Anyone who does anything, they're gonna get arrested. I'm gonna support the police in that. But he also, he was not. He made sure the police were not going to crack down or do anything crazy. And in the end, I mean, maybe because of those efforts, maybe by luck, he ended up being a fairly subdued affair. And the most important thing for him, he was photographed picking up rubbish, on the streets and putting it away. And ultimately, people saw, oh, look, the mayor's getting stuck in. He's personally making sure the streets are clean. That's good. He's a good hard worker.
Right. I think he chides one of the students there. Fred, we were going to say something.
Oh yeah. Someone spills beer in him. When does the beer get spilled? So he is picking up garbage. It's a good moment, but you did mention a drunken reveler spilled beer on Bernie, and I'm still fuming over that. So when did that happen?
There was no, from memory, there was no ill intent. It was just a drunk kid who just kind of, was just just stood next to him and just spilled beer on him, which again probably made him look better. It's like, okay, this guy's so hands on. He's having the drunk kids like vomiting on him and spilling stuff on him.
All right. Certainly a big moment, but of course, not as big as his accomplishments. He was able to do a lot of mayor of Burlington. As we're running out here, what are some of the things that he did wind up accomplishing after this kind of early rough patch?
Yeah, I mean, he had a pretty good kind of public housing project. I mean, when I went to Burlington, I stayed at one of these places that was initially built under his mayoralty, and I mean, these are really high quality public housing, and that was one of his big legacies. There was also the waterfront. This was an issue that he didn't really care that much about, frankly, but he. Greg Guma, who we mentioned, that was a big focus of his, and he told him, if you're going to run for mayor, you should run to keep the waterfront a beautiful public area rather than something that is kind of cluttered with commercial buildings and that kind of thing. And that's actually an interesting story because Sanders did run on that, and then as mayor, he ended up negotiating with the local business community around it, and struck a deal where they were going to let this much commercial construction there, and then keep this much for the public. And the deal he struck initially, people weren't happy with. A lot of his supporters, the people on the ground, revolted and were very annoyed and saw it as a betrayal. And so that kind of forced Sanders to go back to them and go, look, people are not going to swallow this deal. We have to change this. So ultimately, they struck a deal where there was a very, very limited amount of commercial and residential housing that was built there. And the waterfront now is very open. It's actually, the waterfront is the kind of one of the big the jewels of modern Burlington. And it's funny when you go there, you talk to people and they all say, oh, this is what was so great about Sanders as mayor. He made sure that he fought for this. And that's true to an extent, but it was a bit more of a complicated interaction between activists and Sanders. Stuff that people generally talk about how over the course of his mayoralty, he made it one of the most livable cities. That was the big thing when he left office. Eventually, people said that this was such a great place to live. Unfortunately, Burlington today, much like a lot of parts of the United States, is very expensive, and it's super expensive because of housing, particularly. So rents and houses are super expensive. So there's you could argue that there's a bit of a mixed legacy there, but a lot of that also happened once he left office as well. So.
Right.
I did want to ask about the wood burning power plant. Yeah, he approves a wood burning power plant, which feels like some kind of 1800s thing to me. I don't know if this was common at the time or just they didn't want to get coal and they have wood up there. What did you find out about the wood burning power plant and why he decided to do that?
I think this is one of those issues where there was, there's always tension between, even when a politician comes out of an activist movement, there's a tension between him having to abide by what the movement wants and maybe what even that politician in his or her heart wants, and having a govern as a kind of mayor for the entire city. And I think that was one of those things where a lot of environmentalists were angry about it because, I mean, I can't remember the details now, but there was some environmental concern around, I think, the what this was pumping out into the air. But I think he decided that for the purpose of jobs and electricity and everything, it had to be approved. And there's a similar incident, I think, in 1983 when there's a sit-in outside the General Dynamics factory in town. A bunch of anti-war protesters, because I think they were the time it was it supplying something to the Contras? It was supplying something to some U.S. involved conflict that local activists were not happy about, and they were right to not be happy about it. But ultimately, Sanders had them arrested. And so people were not happy about that. But that showed you some of that constant tension that I'm sure we'll see if and when Mamdani wins the mayoralty. That there'll be a time when he has to kind of disappoint the left, disappoint activists.
Right. Though to be fair, yeah, Bernie does have Burlington becomes a city with a foreign policy, as Bernie likes to say, and he visits Nicaragua during the Civil War. But yeah, on that note, what are some lessons Zohran can take from Bernie's mayoralty?
I mean, I think the police thing is key. Sanders built a very good working relationship with the police. I mean, look, Burlington in 1981 to 9 is obviously different from New York City in 2025. But and it may not be that Mamdani's ever going to be able to win over all the police, or even that he should. I mean, obviously, the police need some serious reform in New York and around the country. But I think also there is a lesson there that you need to be able to have a constructive relationship rather than treating the police for all their flaws as a kind of a thing to do battle against. I think that there's a lesson in the harnessing of activists and grassroots energy. That was a big thing for Sanders, because he had this whole door knocking operation. Those people were ultimately the ones who were out in the streets, who were protesting and chanting against the aldermen when they were blocking him from doing stuff. Who were out there, knocking on doors sometimes twice on the same block, kind of preaching the gospel of Bernie, telling people, hey, this guy's trying to get things done. He needs allies in the city council. Vote out these other bums and get him some allies so he can actually win. Sanders also was able to, he went to the state legislature and was able to kind of work with people there and persuade them to not stymie some of what he was doing. And that's something that Zohran's going to have to do as well. I mean, to levy taxes on the rich and that kind of thing. I mean, we'll see how that goes, but there's an element of you have to use a combination of both coercion through the sort of I don't want to say the word intimidation, but the intimidatory element of public opinion. If you can show lawmakers that they are opposing something that's popular, that may not be good for them down the line. But you also have to be persuasive, and you have to work as the mayor. You have to have a friendly, a constructive relationship with people who are in power to be able to get things done. Sanders kind of went to other cities and towns in Vermont, and he tried to work with them. He tried to galvanize them to whether to get a better deal on health insurance or to have him pressure the state legislature. There may be a model there for Mamdani to look at. And I think Sanders' big thing and the people around him, they wanted to out-Republican the Republicans and to just be really effective city administrators, to not be spending massive amounts of money. They wanted to show that they could run a fairly efficient government. And he got lucky because a big thing that happened in his mayoralty was that they found there was all this money that they had that no one had any idea that the city was just sitting on. and so
Oh wow.
that suddenly like fixed this entire problem. They were like, oh my god,
Hmm.
we have to kind of impose austerity, which we promised we wouldn't. So
Was
they
it
got
hidden
lucky.
beneath the floorboards or something? How did
Yeah,
they?
it was some accounting quirk that like
Ah.
basically city accountants or something had just missed that there was like all this money that had been unspent. So yeah, I mean, I doubt that's going to happen with New
Yeah.
York and Iran, but but I think the general kind of idea of like don't as long as you can avoid it, don't impose costs on working people. Try and find other ways to find revenue. Try and run an efficient government, but also don't run an efficient government to the point of austerity. I think those are all lessons that he could take away. And I suspect, having seen Zohran's campaign and the people around it, I think they probably already realize that, and that is their plan if they end up winning the election.
Yeah, I do want to ask about the Jewish angle. We haven't really mentioned that. Yeah, Zohran was running to be the first Muslim mayor in New York, faced a lot of Islamophobia. I don't think Vermont, well, Burlington was that Jewish. Was there any anti-Semitism or saying that this guy's Jewish? And I do even think that then his accountants finding more money almost seems like a positive Jewish stereotype a little bit. If I can say that. But yeah, was there any anti-Semitism?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I don't know if he painted it that way, but that's very funny. I mean, there was a line one of his automatic antagonists used that was like, I can't remember what it was. It wasn't explicitly anti-Semitic, but it was like a dog whistle that was as close as you can get to it without saying it. And but this is the 80s, and I mean, anti-Semitism definitely existed then as it exists now, but I think it wasn't it wasn't like the 50s or something. And instead what it did was whatever this person said, it aroused a lot of outrage, and people were like, oh my god. I mean, generally a key turning point actually in Sanders' mayoralty was the degree of hostility towards him by the city council, and the fact that they just openly would not let him do anything and just tried to block him at every turn, and would like show him immense levels of disrespect constantly. And what they ended up backfiring on them, because what the public saw was, oh, this guy is out there, he's trying to get what he campaigned on done, and they are not letting him. Basically, fuck these people. Let's vote them out, and let's give them a real chance. So that, if anything, there's kind of a lesson for Mamdani's enemies, if they're listening out there. If they go too hard against them and try and destroy him, it actually may not work in their favor. It may end up backfiring on them.
Amen. All right. Well, Branko, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people find you and your stuff?
Yeah, Jacobin.com, Jacobin. Read it if you can spare the money. Subscribe, and if you want to get a more detailed look at this, what we were just talking about, look up the piece, which is headlined.
I have it here. How Bernie Sanders, an open socialist, won Burlington's mayoral election.
When you read it, you're going to want it to be a movie. Yeah, it's just
I mean,
it's exciting. Yeah,
it's a very interesting story. Jeff Stein of the Washington Post, from what I understand, is now running a biography of Sanders. I don't know if it's just his time as mayor or beyond, but that should be interesting, because that'll go into things that we did not cover on this, because like I said, I only ended up doing the first 2 years, and then Sanders lost, and then I got demoralized, and also there were other things to write about. So but the whole thing is really interesting.